The trains arrived in silence. No cheering crowds. No victory parades. Just the low rumble of wheels against iron tracks, carrying hundreds of men who had crossed an ocean not as conquerors, but as prisoners. Italian soldiers, sunburned, hollow-cheeked, their uniforms caked with the dust of North Africa, stepped onto American soil with eyes that had learned to expect nothing. They had been taught what to fear. Axis propaganda had filled their heads with stories of American savagery, of camps where prisoners disappeared into darkness, of captors who showed no mercy. So when the gates of the POW camp swung open and they shuffled through in silent columns, their faces betrayed a kind of numb resignation. This was the end they had been promised. But hunger was the first enemy they had known long before capture. It had gnawed at them in the foxholes of Tunisia, in the bombed-out villages of Sicily, in the long marches where rations dwindled to nothing. Some had gone days without food, surviving on whatever they could scavenge, a handful of olives, stale bread shared among 5 men, water from questionable sources. By the time they surrendered, many were too weak to stand without assistance. So when they arrived at camps across Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, places whose names they couldn't pronounce, they looked first not at the guards, not at the barbed wire, but at the mess halls. Their stomachs had become their calendars, marking time not in days but in meals missed. What they found waiting for them was something none of their training, none of their propaganda, none of their worst fears had prepared them for. The American guards didn't scowl. They didn't shout or shove. Some even nodded, a small acknowledgement, human to human. The camp itself, sprawling across flat American farmland, seemed almost surreal in its orderliness. There were barracks with real beds. Latrines that worked. Medical stations where doctors actually treated wounds rather than turning prisoners away. And there was food. Not scraps. Not punishment rations designed to keep men barely alive. But actual meals, served on metal trays, still warm, portions that seemed impossibly generous to men who had been starving. In those first moments, standing in line at the mess hall, many Italian prisoners felt a dissonance so profound it bordered on vertigo. They had lost the war. They were captives in a foreign land. Everything they had been told suggested this should be their lowest moment. And yet, as the smell of cooking meat and fresh bread drifted through the Texas heat, something unexpected stirred within them, not quite hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin, the faint possibility that survival might mean more than simply not dying. The collapse had come faster than anyone anticipated. Throughout 1943, as Allied forces pushed through North Africa and prepared to invade the Italian mainland, Mussolini's army began to fracture. Not with dramatic battlefield defeats alone, but with something quieter and more devastating, the slow realization among Italian soldiers that the war was lost, that the promises of glory had dissolved into dust and blood, that going home meant more to them than any ideology ever could. When the surrenders began, they came in waves. Entire units laid down their arms, sometimes without firing a shot. In Tunisia, in Sicily, on the rocky shores of Calabria, Italian soldiers raised white flags or simply walked toward Allied lines with their hands up, their faces showing not shame but exhausted relief. The Americans didn't know what to do with them all. Tens of thousands of prisoners, eventually over 50,000 Italian POWs would be held on American soil, needed to be transported, housed, fed, and guarded. Cargo ships that had carried ammunition and tanks eastward returned westward filled with human cargo. The men stood shoulder to shoulder in holds that reeked of saltwater and diesel fuel, wondering what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic. Many expected brutality. Their officers had warned them. The propaganda newsreels had painted Americans as gangsters and capitalists, people without honor or mercy. Some prisoners made quiet pacts with each other. If things became unbearable, they would resist, even if resistance meant death. But when the ships docked at New York, at Norfolk, at New Orleans, and the prisoners were marched down gangplanks into the bright American sunlight, something unexpected happened. Longshoremen paused their work to watch, but not with hatred, with curiosity, sometimes pity. MPs directed the columns of prisoners with firm but not cruel efficiency. And when one Italian soldier collapsed from dehydration on the dock, an American medic rushed over with a canteen, lifting it to the man's lips without hesitation. In those moments, in the gap between expectation and reality, something began to shift. The prisoners had prepared themselves for monsters. What they found instead were men, tired men, overworked men, but men who seemed to operate under a different set of rules than the ones the war had taught. The contrast didn't make sense yet. But sense, they would soon discover, wasn't always a requirement for kindness. The day settled into a rhythm that felt almost absurd in its normalcy. Reveille at dawn. Roll call in neat formations. Work details assigned, some men sent to maintain the camp grounds, others to sort supplies or assist in the kitchens. The structure was military, the discipline real, but without the edge of fear that had defined their service in Mussolini's army. What struck the Italian prisoners most wasn't what the Americans did, but what they didn't do. They didn't withhold medical care. When a prisoner fell ill, malaria from North Africa, respiratory infections from the cramped ship journeys, the camp doctors treated them with the same medicines given to American soldiers. They didn't forbid communication, letters home were allowed, though censored, and mail from Italy occasionally made it through the chaos of war. They didn't crush morale. In camps across Texas, Oklahoma, and the Deep South, American commanders allowed something remarkable: the Italians could sing. They could play soccer on makeshift fields. They could hold Catholic masses in camp chapels, led by priests who were themselves prisoners but given the dignity of their calling. At Camp Como in Mississippi, prisoners organized a full choir that performed arias from Verdi and Puccini, their voices rising over the pine forests in the humid evening air. At Camp Hereford in Texas, they painted murals on barrack walls, scenes of the Italian countryside, of vineyards and medieval towns, small windows into the home they might never see again. The American guards watched these activities not with suspicion but with something closer to bemused respect. Many of the guards were farm boys from Iowa or factory workers from Pennsylvania, men who had never left their home states before the war. To them, these Italians, with their animated conversations, their passionate arguments over soccer games, their inability to drink coffee without theatrical complaints about its quality, seemed almost exotic, but not threatening. Some guards even began learning Italian phrases. Buongiorno. Come stai. Simple words exchanged during roll call, building tiny bridges across the language barrier. Of course, there were rules. The barbed wire was real. Guard towers stood at the corners, and men with rifles kept watch. Escape attempts, though rare, were met with swift recapture. This was still captivity, still prison. But it was prison with an unexpected face. In the evenings, when the Texas sun finally relented and a breeze stirred the dust, prisoners would sit outside their barracks and talk. They talked about their families, wives who didn't know if they were alive, children growing up without fathers, mothers praying to saints for their safe return. They talked about the war, about the battles they'd survived, about friends who hadn't made it onto the surrender boats. And increasingly, they talked about the strangeness of their situation. How could the enemy be so decent? How could the people they'd been trained to hate treat them with more humanity than their own officers sometimes had? The questions had no easy answers. But in the asking, in the slow realization that perhaps the world was more complicated than propaganda had suggested, something fundamental began to change in the hearts of these men behind the wire. It started with a simple request. One morning at Camp Hearn in Texas, an Italian sergeant approached an American guard near the mess hall. His English was broken, assembled from phrases learned in the camp and half-remembered school lessons. He gestured with his hands, the universal language of hunger, and said one word: pain. Bread. The guard, a corporal from Louisiana named James Broussard, nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. The Italian expected what prisoners always expected: a small, hard roll, perhaps stale, the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. Enough to survive, nothing more. What Corporal Broussard returned with made the Italian sergeant stop mid-sentence. 2 full loaves. Fresh. Still warm from the oven, the crust golden brown and crackling. And beside them, wrapped in wax paper, a portion of butter, real butter, not margarine, and a tin cup filled with hot coffee. The sergeant stood frozen, unsure if this was a test, a trick, some elaborate setup for punishment. He looked at the guard's face, searching for mockery or malice. He found neither. "Go on," Broussard said, his accent thick with the bayou. "We got extra from the bakery in town. Can't let it go to waste." Word spread through the camp faster than any rumor. By lunchtime, every prisoner knew about the bread. Some didn't believe it, surely there was a catch, a price to pay later. But when the evening meal was served and the portions remained generous, when the bread kept coming day after day, belief began to settle in. For men who had spent months scraping by on near-starvation rations, who had watched comrades grow skeletal in the African desert, who had learned to stretch a single piece of hardtack across an entire day, this abundance felt like a violation of the natural order of war. Prisoners weren't supposed to eat well. Captivity wasn't supposed to come with butter and coffee. The defeated weren't supposed to be fed like human beings. Yet here they were. Some men wept the first time they ate their fill. Others became quiet, introspective, processing emotions they hadn't expected to feel in an enemy camp. A few wrote letters home describing the meals in such detail that censors worried the letters might be code for something else. Surely no prisoner ate this well. But they did. And in that simple act, the giving of bread, the sharing of coffee, the small dignities that acknowledged the prisoners as men rather than numbers, something profound occurred. It's difficult to hate someone who feeds you. Difficult to maintain the walls of propaganda when they crumble before the basic human gesture of hospitality. Difficult to see monsters in the faces of men who give you bread and expect nothing in return. The war wasn't over. The wire still stood. But within it, a different kind of battle had been won, quietly, without fanfare, one loaf at a time. The rumor started in Barrack 7. Tomorrow, a prisoner whispered to his bunkmate, "They're serving lasagna." Laughter rippled through the room. Lasagna? In a prison camp in the middle of Texas? Impossible. Someone had misheard. Someone was playing a cruel joke. Perhaps the American cooks had attempted some bastardized version of Italian food and butchered it beyond recognition, that seemed more likely than actual lasagna. But the rumor persisted. It moved through the camp like wildfire, each telling adding new details, each retelling met with increasing skepticism. By evening, it had become almost a running joke. Men placed mock bets with cigarette rations. Some practiced exaggerated expressions of disappointment for when the inevitable letdown came. The next morning, the mess hall smelled different. Even from outside, walking across the dusty camp yard toward breakfast, the prisoners could detect it, the unmistakable aroma of tomato sauce simmering with garlic and oregano, the rich scent of baked cheese, the kind of smell that reaches into your memory and pulls out Sunday dinners, grandmother's kitchens, home. The line moved slowly. Men pressed forward, trying to see over the shoulders ahead of them, straining to glimpse what was being served. And then the first prisoner reached the serving window and stopped, causing a pile-up behind him. There, in industrial-sized baking trays, layer upon layer of pasta, meat sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella, actual lasagna. The camp cooks, many of them Italian-Americans from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, stood behind the line with something like pride on their faces. They had worked through the night, using their own family recipes, pulling favors to get extra cheese and ground beef from the quartermaster, determined to serve something authentic. "Andiamo," one of the cooks said, waving the stunned prisoner forward. "Before it gets cold." The portions weren't small. The coffee wasn't weak. And alongside the lasagna, there were breadsticks, proper breadsticks, and a small salad with oil and vinegar. For many of the prisoners, it was the first taste of home they'd had in years. Some ate in silence, tears streaming down their faces, unable or unwilling to explain the emotion that comes from tasting your mother's cooking made by the hands of your captors. Others ate with their eyes closed, savoring each bite, trying to make it last as long as possible. In the corner of the mess hall, a group of prisoners began singing, softly at first, then gaining confidence. Torna a Sorriento, an old Neapolitan song, the words drifting over the tables like a prayer. The American guards didn't stop them. Some even listened, leaning against the walls, moved by something they didn't fully understand. Later, in letters home that would be carefully censored and stamped, prisoners tried to describe that day. They struggled with the words, knowing their families might not believe them. How do you explain that in a prison camp thousands of miles from home, the enemy served you lasagna? How do you reconcile that with everything you've been taught about war? They feed us like sons, one prisoner wrote. I do not understand this place. Neither did anyone else. But understanding, perhaps, wasn't the point. The gesture itself, the care, the effort, the recognition of shared humanity, spoke louder than any explanation could. The kindness wasn't accidental. It was policy. Across the United States, from Florida to California, over 400 POW camps housed enemy soldiers, Italian, German, Japanese, under a system deliberately designed to uphold both the letter and the spirit of the Geneva Convention. But more than that, it reflected something deeper in the American approach to the war, the belief that how you treat your enemies says as much about you as how you treat your friends. In Washington, military planners had made a calculated decision. Treat prisoners well, and you accomplish multiple goals. You encourage enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. You demonstrate to the world, and particularly to neutral nations, that American values mean something even in wartime. And perhaps most pragmatically, you ensure that when American POWs fall into enemy hands, there's diplomatic leverage to demand their decent treatment. But there was something else, too, something less strategic and more fundamentally American. The camps were often built in rural areas, places where the local population had no direct experience with the war's violence. To the farmers of Oklahoma, the shopkeepers of Kansas, the small-town residents of Mississippi, these Italian prisoners weren't abstractions, they were boys who looked tired, who smiled shyly when given a Coca-Cola, who worked hard in the fields when asked. Many Italian POWs were put to work addressing America's wartime labor shortage. They harvested cotton, picked fruit, worked in canneries and lumber mills. They earned small wages, 80 cents a day in camp scrip, and used it to buy toiletries, cigarettes, small luxuries from the camp store. The work was hard but not cruel. Supervisors treated them as laborious, not slaves. On some farms, something extraordinary happened. Italian prisoners would work alongside local families, sharing lunch in the shade of a barn, learning English phrases, teaching Italian words in return. Farmers' wives sent extra food to the camps. Children befriended prisoners who carved wooden toys or taught them Italian songs. This wasn't universal. There were camps with harsher conditions, guards who were less sympathetic, communities that remained hostile. But the overall pattern held. Italian POWs in America experienced captivity that bore little resemblance to the horrors of Axis prison camps, where Allied soldiers starved, froze, and died by the thousands. The contrast wasn't lost on the prisoners themselves. They heard whispers of what happened to Allied POWs in German and Japanese camps, the brutality, the starvation, the casual disregard for human life. Some felt shame that their own country had participated in such systems. Others felt a quiet gratitude that they had been fortunate enough to surrender to Americans rather than face the Eastern Front or worse. In one documented case, a group of Italian prisoners at Camp Monticello in Arkansas wrote a collective letter to the camp commander thanking him for their treatment. "You have shown us that honor still exists in this war," they wrote. "You have treated us not as fascists, but as Italians. As men." The commander kept that letter for the rest of his life. It sat framed on his desk, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, decency was still a choice, and sometimes, choosing it changed everything. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Prisoners who had arrived sullen and defeated began volunteering for extra work details. They repaired fences without being asked. They tended gardens around the camp with unexpected care, planting vegetables and flowers, bringing small touches of beauty to the dusty Texas landscape. At Camp Hearn, Italian POWs built a full-scale replica of the Leaning Tower of Pisa using scrap wood and concrete. It stood 15 feet tall, carefully painted, a monument to homesickness and hope. The American guards helped them, bringing materials, offering advice on structural engineering, treating the project not as a waste of time but as something important. Some prisoners became friends with locals. Farmers who employed them would invite them for Sunday dinner, against regulations, but overlooked by sympathetic commanders who understood that humanity sometimes required bending rules. Italian soldiers sat at American tables, eating pot roast and apple pie, looking at family photographs, struggling through conversations that mixed 3 languages and relied heavily on hand gestures. Letters intercepted by military censors revealed a profound confusion among the prisoners. "How can they be so kind?" one man wrote to his wife. "They have every reason to hate us, yet they treat us like brothers." Another wrote, "I came here expecting to die slowly. Instead, I am eating better than I did in my own army. I play soccer. I attend mass. I laugh with the guards. Nothing makes sense anymore." Some prisoners decided they wanted to return to America after the war, not as captives, but as immigrants. They had seen something here that Italy, ravaged by decades of fascism and war, couldn't offer: opportunity, abundance, a kind of casual optimism that seemed built into the American character. A few fell in love with local women, exchanging furtive glances at church services or during trips into town under guard. These relationships were forbidden, complicated, often doomed, but they happened anyway, because war doesn't stop the human heart from wanting connection, wanting hope, wanting to believe in a future beyond the wire. By late 1944, as Italy switched sides and joined the Allies, many Italian POWs began serving as cooperators, working even more freely, treated almost as Allied soldiers rather than prisoners. The distinction became increasingly blurred. What do you call a man who is technically a captive but is trusted, fed well, paid for his labor, and treated with dignity? Perhaps simply this: to man. The repatriation ships sailed in 1945 and 1946, carrying tens of thousands of Italian prisoners back across the Atlantic. Many left with tears in their eyes. They carried with them photographs, snapshots taken with American guards, pictures of the farms where they'd worked, images of the small towns that had become unexpectedly familiar. They carried addresses written on scraps of paper, promises to write, invitations to return someday under better circumstances. Some carried more: English phrases learned and practiced, a taste for American coffee, memories of kindness that had redefined what they thought they knew about the world. When they arrived home, they found an Italy transformed by war, bombed cities, shattered infrastructure, a population exhausted and disillusioned. In that devastation, their stories of American prison camps seemed almost fantastical. Friends and family listened with skepticism. "You're exaggerating," they said, making it sound better than it was. But the letters kept coming from America. Christmas cards from farmers in Oklahoma. Packages with coffee and chocolates from guards in Texas. Invitations: "If you ever want to come back, we'll sponsor you." And some did return. In the 1950s and 60s, former prisoners immigrated to the United States, settling in the very towns where they had once been held captive. They opened restaurants and shops, married American women, raised children who grew up speaking English with Italian accents inherited from their fathers. Years later, journalists would track down these men, now elderly, and ask them about their experience. Almost universally, they spoke of the prison camps not with bitterness but with something like nostalgia, a strange, complicated gratitude for captivity that had shown them a different way of living. One former prisoner, visiting Texas in the 1980s, stood at the site of the camp where he'd spent 2 years. It was just an empty field now, the barracks long demolished, nothing but grass and wind. He wept quietly, remembering the lasagna, the soccer games, the American guard who had learned to say buongiorno every morning. "They didn't have to be kind," he said to the journalist. "But they were. And it changed me." In the end, perhaps that was the most powerful victory of all, not the one won on battlefields, but the one won in mess halls and work details and small gestures of human decency. The victory that proved even in war, especially in war, how we treat those who have surrendered to us defines who we are. The barbed wire is gone now. But the memory of what happened within it remains, a quiet testament to the possibility that kindness, even in captivity, can be its own form of liberation.